What's up, ladies and gentlemen? In this video we're going to get into the death and burial of Robert Johnson. Now, Robert Johnson's entire life is a mystery, and his death is no different. You've got lack of documentation, you've got hearsay, you've got mythology, and it's a pretty difficult subject to get into if you want to get the history straight. But I'm going to give you what I think is a good rundown of what may or may not have happened and what's most believable. So let's begin at the beginning of the end. Now, in August 1938, Robert Johnson was still an itinerant blues singer, busking on street corners, in front of shops, playing at country dances, and not really making a ton of money. And just over a year earlier, he had recorded the 29 songs that we still have of him today. His recordings had been done in 2 sessions in 1936 and 1937 in Texas, so all the music we have is really just a snapshot of the last few years of his life. He hadn't sold a huge number of records, but Terraplane Blues was a regional hit, and that's the song he was known for at the time. Now, Vocalion Records was still releasing singles right up till the time he died, and they released one, Love in Vain, a year after he died. In the last days of his life, he found himself in Greenwood, Mississippi. He had apparently come down from Tunica and spent a few weeks renting a room in a part of Greenwood called Baptist Town. That part of Greenwood was a go-to spot for blues singers. Tommy McLennan was staying there, and Robert probably visited with him. But he was booked to play at a spot called Three Forks in a juke joint behind Pemberton's store, and that's where he played his last gig. And this was a classic juke joint. Juke joints, or barrel houses, were little hole-in-the-wall drinking establishments where sharecroppers and other kinds of laborers would go on the weekend to, just drink and dance and gamble and unwind after a long work week. These places were often located on the edge of a plantation. They would hire whatever blues musicians were in town to play these places on the weekends so people could dance and have a good time. Now, the musicians playing in juke joints wouldn't have just been doing blues. They would have been doing jazz tunes, pop hits, country songs, whatever was popular with audiences at the time. And that's what Robert and his musical partners were hired to do at Three Forks on Saturday night. Three Forks was located at the modern-day intersection of highways 82 and 49 East, and you can see it right there. The building is no longer there. And just to confuse things, there was another place in the area called Three Forks Store at another intersection, but that's not considered the right place. On the night in question, the bluesmen Honey Boy Edwards and Sonny Boy Williamson II were there, and Honey Boy Edwards is going to be kind of important for this video. Now, David Honey Boy Edwards was a musical partner of Robert's. He played guitar, and he lived to be 96 years old and played his entire life. He was probably the last living pre-war Delta blues singer left alive. He had lived around Greenwood, he knew the area, and Robert was dating his cousin, Willie Mae Powell, and her name is actually mentioned in Love in Vain.
Willie Mae.
Honey Boy's account is probably the only eyewitness account we have of Robert Johnson's last days. And his story has expanded and changed over the years, so there are inconsistencies, so bear that in mind. Some of the details I've given so far, like where he was staying and where his last gig was, come from his account, but here's what else he has to say. On Saturday, Robert had been picked up in Baptist Town and brought out to Three Forks by car. Honey Boy went out there later. Honey Boy says Robert was sick by the time he got there after drinking some poison whiskey. That's if you don't count the version where he says he knocked the bottle of poison whiskey out of Robert's hand and told him not to drink it. But usually he goes with the former claim. He was certain that Robert had been poisoned by the guy who ran the juke because Robert had been seeing the guy's wife, and the guy had given the liquor to someone else to serve him without them knowing the poison was in it. Eventually he got so sick that he could no longer play, and they carried him back to his place at Baptist Town. And after that, Honey Boy went about his business thinking that Robert would be fine. But he did go see him a few days later and said he was rolling in the floor and howling and in agonizing pain, and shortly thereafter he died, and Honey Boy says he died in Baptist Town. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, share this video. Doesn't cost you anything. I've also got lots of great stuff in the description below, like albums of mine. I've got a Patreon you can check out with exclusive content on there, and I've also got a PayPal if you want to throw me a tip or something like that. Lots of other stuff linked below. Now, this brings us to a really murky part of the story, where he actually died. In all likelihood, he didn't die in Baptist Town, but on a plantation called Star of the West. Star of the West is where the man who dug his grave, Tom Eskridge, lived. and it's conveniently located right next to the accepted burial place. And Three Forks is right there next to Star of the West Plantation. And you get different stories on this. Was he carried back to Baptisttown, then taken to the house on Star of the West? Was it the other way around? Or did he even make the trip? Well, whatever happened, it's pretty certain that he died at Star of the West for the reasons I just mentioned earlier, and the fact that Luther Wade, the owner of the plantation, is the one who instructed Tom Eskridge to dig his grave. The note on the back of his death certificate also mentions him dying on a plantation. You often hear that the tenant house where Robert died was lived in by a man named Tush Hogg. Now, I don't know about that. Tush Hogg was actually a slang term back then. It meant a flashy dresser or a tough guy. So it might have been the guy's nickname, who knows. Whatever the details, he died on Tuesday, August 16th after being in terrible pain since the previous Saturday. Now I'll give you some of the theories that have been thrown out there as to what he actually died of. When I first learned about Robert Johnson as a teenager, I'd read somewhere that he died of strychnine poisoning. And I believed that for a while, but he actually lingered for days, and if he had been given strychnine, he wouldn't have made it past the first day. Another way more convincing theory is that he was poisoned with a substance called naphthalene. Naphthalene came from dissolved mothballs, and it was actually popular in the South back then for bartenders to slip it into people's drinks who were causing trouble as a punishment. It usually didn't kill people, but Robert supposedly had a stomach ulcer, and it could have caused the ulcer to hemorrhage. Naphthalene is known to cause stomach pain, and this seems to be what Robert was going through. On the other hand, he may not have been poisoned at all. It's been claimed that he may have died from complications of Marfan syndrome. People say he might have had Marfan's from looking at pictures of him, and Marfan's can cause dissection of the aorta, which can give you terrible pain in your chest. Then you have syphilis. Syphilis is the cause of death suggested by the note on the back of the birth certificate, but there's not much basis in it. This is the opinion of the plantation owner who didn't know him and wasn't a doctor and wasn't a medical examiner. Speaking of the death certificate, let's talk about that. It was discovered in the 60s, and it's not really a huge trove of information, but there are a few things we can learn from it. You can see that he died outside of Greenwood, which again rules out Baptisttown. You can see that he wasn't seen by a doctor, and you get the date of death and burial. What's interesting is that the county registrar put some information on the back, and I'll read it here for you. It's got some pretty politically incorrect language, so I'll kind of skip around that. I talked with the white man on whose place this man died, and I also talked with a woman on the place. The plantation owner said the man, seemingly about 26 years old, came from Tunica 2 or 3 weeks before he died to play banjo at a dance given there on the plantation. He stayed in the house with some of the people, saying he wanted to pick cotton. The white man did not have a doctor for this dude, as he had not worked for him. He was buried in a homemade coffin furnished by the county. The plantation owner said it was his opinion that the man died of syphilis. Now, I take the banjo thing with a grain of salt, but could it be that Robert Johnson played his last gig on a banjo? Who knows? But it also says his coffin was given by the county, which is in line with the kind of burial he would have gotten. It was probably a pretty Spartan burial because remember, he was a broke musician from out of town. You might be surprised to know that Robert Johnson has not one, not two, but 3 different graves. Part of the confusion comes from the fact that the death certificate lists Zion Church as the place of burial. Well, there are more than one churches in the area with the word Zion in the name, so that's not quite specific enough. The first grave marker was placed in 1991 at Payne Chapel in Quito, a few miles outside of Greenwood. It was put there by a rock band called the Tombstones, and they based their location on information in a magazine article from a lady called Queen Elizabeth Thomas, who had claimed to have dated Robert Johnson. There's pretty much no other basis for thinking this is the burial site, and most people don't think it is. That same year in 1991, the Mount Zion Memorial Fund, along with Columbia Records, paid for an obelisk to be placed at Mount Zion Church in Morgan City, Mississippi, about 16 miles outside of Greenwood. Now, the Morgan City monument doesn't claim to mark the exact spot of his grave, but proponents of it believed that he's in that graveyard. Last but not least is the most likely location of his grave site, and the one with the most consensus and supporting evidence. Little Mount Zion Church outside of Greenwood and conveniently located right next to Star of the West Plantation. Rose Eskridge, wife of the Tom Eskridge that I mentioned earlier, said that her husband dug Robert's grave and that she was at the funeral. She didn't really appreciate blues music for religious and moral reasons and would have no reason to want to be associated with the Robert Johnson myth. But she said a preacher said some words around noon, and they committed him to the earth in a pine box. Now later on, his sister Carrie had an undertaker reinter him in a nicer coffin. Rose Eskridge was able to point out the spot where he was buried underneath a pecan tree towards the back of the cemetery. And here's a picture of me there having a bad hair day with the wind blowing. And the tombstone is inscribed with a handwritten note that came from the family papers that he supposedly wrote as he was dying. And it reads, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of Jerusalem, I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he will call me from the grave." It's also worth mentioning that not long after Robert died, John Hammond from Columbia Records was looking for him because he was putting on a show at Carnegie Hall. John Hammond is pretty legendary. He's responsible for signing people like Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen and Stevie Ray Vaughan. And his son, John Hammond Jr., is actually a country blues artist. It was actually John Hammond who re-released Robert Johnson's music in 1961 and made him the superstar that he is now. The show was called From Spirituals to Swing, and after he found out that Robert Johnson was dead, he got Big Bill Broonzy to represent country blues. He also played one of Robert Johnson's records on the stage on a record player. So there's a good bit of what's known or at least speculated about the death of Robert Johnson. And here are what I think are the most solid facts. He was outside of Greenwood playing in a juke joint. He became ill. He died on the Star of the West plantation and was buried at Little Mount Zion Church. So comment below with your theories and what you think is the most believable scenario. This subject will take you down a huge rabbit hole, believe me. People have spent their entire lives trying to get to the bottom of what happened. So I hope you found my take on this informing. Before I go, I'd like to tell you about my live streams that I do every Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, uncensored. I play the blues, I read comments, and be there or be stupid or something. See you later.